And with all of you here this morning, just want you to stop and think, do we feel fortunate to be here? Just think about that for a moment. Or maybe you want to think, are we lucky? And personally, I don't like luck because I think we make our own luck in life. But we've all got a story as to why we're here. Me, simply, I had a grandfather who went away to fight in the First World War, came back with my grandmother as a Christadelphian. All right, that's my connection. So each of us have got a story. We might have had parents, we've been brought up in the faith, we've had other means where we've met people, or for some reason or not, there's always a story with us here as to why we are here and how we got here, all right? So I want us to think this morning, do we value our position as being a Christadelphian, as being part of our faith? And of course, the purpose of us being here this morning is that we're here to think about ourselves in terms of self-examination. We've got an example of faith, of course, the epitome of our faith is the Lord Jesus Christ, and we reflect or we consider ourselves against his character. So part of our faith and part of our belief in God is that God cares and provides for us. So if you're looking for a theme of my exhortation, it's actually providence, all right? So ask yourself, well, what is providence? Think about the word for the moment, providence, or to provide. If you looked up the dictionary, there's a number of definitions which are all pretty similar. For example, it's the protective care of God or of nature as a spiritual power. It is also the timely preparation for future eventualities. And the last one that I liked here, the guardianship and care provided by a deity or God. But when you look a little bit further, I've got some quotes here that I think really encapsulate what providence is all about for us as part of our faith and part of our belief. E.B. Adams, in the Christadelphian magazine of 1953, wrote, "Providence is the omnipotent power of God who, seeing the end of all things from the beginning, provides for all the needs of his creation." And it's, in a way, quite a wordy or complete, if you like, expression or statement of what providence is. I like the quote from Robert Roberts, who says in his book, The Ways of Providence, he says simply that providence is a divine interposition in human affairs. All right? Meaning simply that God puts somebody there as a go-between to be able to control or order things in the affairs of mankind. So you might ask yourself, well, who does providence apply to? All right, well, I sort of really put it down to two basic levels. You've got global providence, all right, and you've got individual providence. Well, what do you mean by global providence? Well, I think if you go to Daniel 4 and verse 17, a verse that we well know really sums this up, where God says that, or Daniel says that this matter is by the decree of the watchers and the demand by the word of the holy ones, to the intent that the living may know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will, and setteth up over it the basest of men. So think about those words for a moment and think of what's going on in the world at the moment. In a nutshell, Western society is in decline, okay? It's being subverted by really what are essentially communist ideas and influence. It's being channeled through the Muslim community, Palestine, anti-Semitism, all these things that are going on about us at the moment. We look at leaders like Donald Trump, and we wonder sometimes about his role in the affairs of men. We look at other nations, countries, influences. We sometimes think, well, where is it all going? And to put it in perspective for us as Christadelphians, we've got to stop and think that God is in control of human affairs So whatever happens really at the end of the day is going to work towards his purpose, all right? And of course, his purpose involves us, which then when it comes down to us, okay, it involves us, and in terms, of course, we'll talk about our faith in a moment, but he intercedes, if you like, where it is necessary to fulfill his purpose. Now, God doesn't intercede in every event, so it's not as if he's in a micromanagement sort of control of things, right? Mankind is still left largely to his own devices, all right? And then probably that's encapsulated by the concept of time and chance. We know from Ecclesiastes 9 verse 11, Solomon writes that he says, "Again I saw that under the sun the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to the intelligent, nor favour to the skillful, but time and chance happeneth to them all." So what's the whole idea with this time and chance thing? Are we subject to time and chance? Well, I think we've got to understand that God has control of time and chance, but not all chance is controlled. Things in life, particularly for everybody, happen, all right? God, like I say, only intercedes when his purpose requires it. So whether controlled or not, God still allows independence of action. Now, when we think of that on a global level, that's certainly true. But when we come now to an individual level or a personal level, there is a point of difference, okay? Now, I read we had Matthew 6 read for us because I think this, again, says it on an individual level in terms of how we should view our life and live our lives. Because he says in verse 25, "Don't worry about your life, what you're going to eat or drink, or about your body, or what you will wear. Is not life more than the food, and body more than clothing?" Right, so this is a pretty big ask when God says, look, now don't worry about your food, don't worry about your clothes, don't worry about anything, okay? Because he says there, look at the air. Oh, he has examples, we'll go into these in a minute. But it's a pretty big ask, isn't it, when we're asked to think not to worry about these everyday things, all right? Because God says, look at the birds of the air, they don't sow, they don't reap, yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not more value for they? So it's a pretty big ask, isn't it, when you think about us having to put our trust and our faith in God to what? To provide, okay? Providence, God, as we believe, working in our lives for the better of our life and our faith and the goodness of the things in which we live. So he says, look, what's the point of worrying? Verse 27, can you add a single digit to your, a single hour to your span of life? Consider the lilies of the field. He talks about Solomon. Look, in all his glory and wisdom, he couldn't be arrayed like these. But God's going to clothe the grass of the field, which is alive today, tomorrow is thrown in the oven. In other words, dies off when winter comes. But so much more will he clothe you of little faith. So why worry about what we shall eat or what we shall drink? Because God knows of our needs before we do. And that's providence. But he asks them to seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added to you as well. Now, it's funny, I have a simple analogy for this. I've been self-employed for years now. And sometimes when you think things aren't going so well, what do? Well, you just do what is right. You stick to what you know, all right, eventually, and you work, to the way that you work, and of that you get a result, all right? So often that's as simple as this. You work hard, you stick to what you know, adjust a little bit as you go, but you eventually get a result. And if we're singularly focused on our faith and we practice this, God will care for us. And it is largely determined by faith. So ask yourself this question: how do we measure our faith? Or can faith be measured? So if I said to you all this morning, I want you to think now, where would I rank my faith on, say, a level of 1 being very weak to a level of 10 being, faith in overdrive or whatever. All right, just think about that a moment. Can it be measured? Well, don't know what you're thinking at the moment, but I don't think it's that important, or I don't think it can be measured because, well, what does Jesus say? He says, "Verily I say unto you, if faith as a grain of a mustard seed, you shall say unto this mountain, remove hence to yonder place, and it shall remove, and nothing shall be impossible to you." So how big's a mustard seed? Well, I like grainy mustard, so you get it in a jar and it's about so big. I suppose the point is that faith is faith, all right? And I don't think we can measure how big or small it is, but if we have faith and we continue our faith, God's grace and providence will be extended to us, all right? Just a little sidebar here. Do you think there's ever an instance with God in terms of that he withdraws his providence? I don't know. I tend to think of Saul, when it said there that, I'll just read the quote. "This providence leave, or does God withdraw it?" And he said, "The Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul," all right? So God was no longer with him. Why? I think Saul, who knows, whatever faith he had lost it. He consulted a witch, didn't he? So it says there, of course, that an evil spirit tormented him. And that's, he was left to his own devices. Personally, I think Saul was probably bipolar, all right, which would explain some of his most unusual behaviours with David, but that's probably the point. But with us, providence relies on our faith. And often the thing is with providence is that we don't see it in our lives. Not until, if you like, a number of years later, we can look at things in retrospect. And I can think of a number of things that I've been through over the years, and I think, well, at the time I wasn't real happy about it. In some cases I was pretty angry. I can think of one particular instance where I was accepted for a job somewhere, and anyway, it all fell apart. And anyway, it turned out the firm that I was going to work for went broke 6 months later. So I look back and I think we would say in the modern vernacular, I dodged a bullet. But I think, well, maybe that was just providence, all right, that I didn't end up in a situation that would have been even worse, okay? Now, just before we get to the emblems, I just want to consider, I think, one of the greatest examples of providence in the scriptures, and that's the story of Joseph, all right? So we're just going to sort of, sounds bad when I say skip through it here, but I just want to highlight a few things that we don't think about when we read the story, because that's what we do sometimes. We read it and we read it like it's a story and think, oh yeah, next minute he did this, and then he was dumped in a well, and then he was off to prison and what have you. So if we look at Genesis 37, and turn to it if you like, I've got a few verses here. So in Genesis 37, verse 3 to 4, it says there, "Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was a son of his old age. Also he made him a tunic of many colours, or coat of many stripes, depending which version you want to read there. But when his brothers saw that the father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him." So think about the language here. And let's just take a step back and look at this situation. How old was Joseph here? He was about 17, all right? My impression is that he's almost the second youngest son of 12 sons. He probably hasn't experienced the hard work, or maybe the hardship of his older brothers. He's favoured above all of them. He's son number 11, by the way. And Dad gives him this special coat to wear. So here's this 17-year-old, the world is his oyster, so to speak, parading around in his nice flash coat in front of his brothers, okay? And he starts dreaming. And it says there that, he dreams what he doesn't realise at the time are prophetic dreams, all right? And he tells them to his brothers. So you can imagine the dynamic that's going on here at the moment. you've got this young guy walking around. He's he's a dreamer. These days I'd say he's probably a little bit out of touch with reality. And he was young, inexperienced, and he's living in his own little world, so to speak. And because of these dreams, they envied him so much that they hated him even more for his dreams or his words in verse 8. Now, hate is a very strong emotion, and we'll see how strong it is as we read further here. But again, Joseph at the time, unbeknown to him, he was divinely communicating forecasts of coming events, as Robert Roberts quite eloquently puts it. So we have a situation now where Joseph is sent by his father to go inquire of his brothers. So imagine this 17 thinks, oh, this is a pretty good day. Dad wants me to go see my brothers, see how they're going, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, I'll go off to see them, see how they're all going, say hello, blah, blah, blah. Now, in verse 18, it says there, then the situation starts to change a little bit. He says, when they saw him afar off, even before they came near them, they conspired against him to kill him. Now, remember I said hatred is a very strong emotion. It is so bad amongst their brothers that they want to murder their own brother, their father's favourite, all right? Look, this dreamer is coming. Let us kill him and cast him into some pit, and we shall say, a beast has devoured him. We will see what will become of his dreams after this, all right? So you think about it. Here's Joseph coming along. However he got there, riding a horse or a donkey or walking, I don't know. Probably thinks, oh, gee, it'd be great to see my brothers. And all the while, before he even gets there, they're conspiring, all of them, to kill him. Okay, such is their hatred of him. You find in verse 21 that but when Reuben heard it, he delivered him out of their hands and said, look, let us not kill him. He had no blood. Let's just cast him into this pit which is within the wilderness and do not lay a hand on him. Obviously with the objective that he could deliver them later and return him back to the father. So at least we've got one of the brothers that's got some sort of moral conscience about this. But it's only Reuben. It's not the rest of them. They all want him dead. So when it came to pass in verse 23 that he come to his brothers, they stripped him of his tunic, the tunic of many colours that was on him, and they took him and cast him into a pit, and the pit was empty and there was no water in it. Okay, so stop about this. Can you imagine this 17-year-old walking up and the brothers basically attacking him, stripping him of his clothes and putting him into a pit? Now you might think, oh yeah, just put it over there. This well could have been anywhere from 20, 30, 40 metres deep, all right? So you can imagine being lowered down into a well or a dry well or a hole in the ground or a pit with no way of getting out, okay? You can imagine at the bottom, it was dry, it could have been muddy, and being left down there and looking up and barely all you could see was just a shaft of sunlight at the top. Can you imagine his feeling at the time as to thought, well, what's this all about? What's going on here? All right? So, the emotion that would have gone through him at the moment, totally unexpected and sort of totally, if you like, naive to the whole situation. So what did the brothers do? Verse 25, they sat down to eat a meal, all right? And just so happens while they were, having lunch, so to speak, they lifted their eyes and looked where there was a company of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels, bearing spices, balm and myrrh on their way down to Egypt. So Judah, very enterprisingly, says to his brothers, yeah, we can make some money out of this. What's the profit, in doing this and killing him, right? If we, kill our brother and conceal his blood. So, to remove our guilt, if you like, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not let our hand be upon him, for he's our brother and our flesh. Gee, how considerate. Anyway, when the Midianite traders passed by, they pulled him out of the pit and lifted him up out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. Now, isn't that interesting? And they took Joseph to Egypt. Now, we just read that and you think, oh, yeah, it's part of the story. They took him out and they sold him. Well, imagine this kid being pulled up out of that pit. When they get out, they sell him to this bunch of Ishmaelites. Do you think, like, oh, come over here, Joseph, grab a horse and will trot off into the sunset. No, it's not like that. They would have bound him. Okay, they would have treated him as a lesser mortal, as a slave, all right? Something to be sold, a chattel, all right? So this is no pleasant experience, but we sort of read the narrative and we think, oh, that's the next part of the story, blah, blah, blah. He's a 17-year-old kid, and this is what's happening to him. So imagine if it was you. I mean, boy, okay? But there's nothing here, of course, in a way to indicate, in the narrative, to indicate Joseph's terror. And it's not until later, and this is 20 years later, when his brothers went to Egypt. In Genesis 42, it says in verse 21, they said to one another, and listen to this, we are truly guilty concerning our brother. This is 20 years later. For we saw the anguish of his soul when he pleaded with us, and we would not hear. Imagine how cold-hearted they were about this. Therefore, this distress has come upon us. If you like, this is payback for them, or the way they thought about it. New English Version sort of translates it, I think, with a little more meaning. They said to another, surely we are being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life. He pleaded with us, but we would not listen. That's why this distress has come upon us. So think about it up to this point of time. Do you think Joseph was thinking, no problem, it's all part of God's plan, it's providence working my life? Really, I think not, okay? Would he have been able to equate the dreams that he had, that he would tell his brothers, with what was happening here? Not at all, okay? So he's 17. We go on to what I call stage 2 of Joseph's life, and he's sold in Egypt into Potiphar's house. Now it says here he was a goodly person and well favoured. Basically saying he was a good looking bloke, all right? A bit of a hunk, in today's language, all right? So it's not long before he is placed in a position of responsibility. He's set up as head of Potiphar's house. Of course, we know what happens next is that Potiphar's wife approaches Joseph, okay? And at the risk of, shall we say, some infidelity, Joseph flees from her, but of course then she accuses him of impropriety. What happens just when things are going well, after being sold as a slave, after being almost murdered by his brothers, what happens? He's cast into prison. Now, again, we read the narrative, it's part of the story, Potiphar's house, happy. He's, Potiphar's wife, she makes a play on him. He ends up in prison. Okay, right. Let's read from Psalm 105 and see how good prison was to him. Because it says in Psalm 105, verse 16, talking about Joseph, and I'll read from verse 16, he said, he called down famine on the land and destroyed all their supplies of food, this is God. And he sent a man before them, Joseph, sold as a slave. So it's not as if he got some little passage to Egypt or some sort of free ride. He was sold as a slave. Look at verse 18. They bruised his feet with shackles. His neck was put in irons till what he foretold came to pass, till the word of the Lord proved him true. So no pleasant experience again. Bruised his feet with shackles. And his neck, would you imagine an iron collar put around your neck with chains, walking around that? A horrible, horrible experience. But we know in verse 20 that the king sent and released him, the rulers of the people set him free. He made him master of his household, rule over all he's possessed, to instruct his princes as he pleased and teach his elders wisdom, which was what was going to be the end result of God's plan with him. But again, at this stage, do you think Joseph's thinking, it's okay, providence, God's looking after me, it's part of his plan? I don't think so at all right? He would be just sort of, going through this sort of cycle of 1 minute, things are turning out okay, next minute, everything's, it's just gone bad again. So he's placed in prison. So once again, he's blessed in that he's put in a position of responsibility. And it's here that he's presented with the dreams of Pharaoh's butler and baker. Now, the outcomes. You remember the dreams. The baker, all manner of bread on his head, and the ravens or the birds were coming and eating out of his head. And of course, I can't remember the butler's dream. The point is there that he restored the chief butler to his butlership again, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the baker as Joseph had interpreted them, yet the chief butler did not remember Joseph but forgot him. So remember, what did Joseph ask when he interpreted the dreams? He said, please remember me, to Pharaoh, to anybody. In other words, remember me, get me out of this jam, all right? So we're thinking, okay, you go to the next stage of the story and you just think it just sort of all flows. But we notice in Genesis 41 that it came to pass at the end of 2 full years. So from the time he interpreted the dream until the next opportunity to come, he had 2 years in prison. 2 years in prison. Could you think of anything worse? All right? And would Joseph be thinking, all part of God's plan? No, I don't think so. So just think about this too. We'll just pause here. How many years do you think Joseph had been away since being sold into captivity by his brothers? I can tell you now, it was about 14 years. 14 years of a life that, saw potential one minute and, of course, then tragedy the next. But from this, we see that as he interprets Pharaoh's dreams, the opportunity is there again to raise him up to a position of authority, in this case, a position of power. He's raised from prisoner to governor of all Egypt overnight. So we could probably say, in our modern vernacular, he's gone from the basement to the penthouse, all right? And it doesn't get any better than that. And what would you think Joseph would have felt at this stage? Think about that. He's second in the land in terms of power, right? How would he have thought? Would he have thought, oh, this is God's plan starting to come to fruition? No, not at all. Look at what happens when he has his firstborn son. In chapter 41, verse 51, he said, Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh, all right? Now, the Hebrew is nasha, which means to forget. And he said, it is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household. So can you feel for his grief, his sadness? It should be a moment of joy that he has his first child, a firstborn son. But what did he do? He calls him Nasha, to forget. And that was Joseph's feeling. That's what he was thinking at this time. All right? So Joseph now is probably about 31 years of age. Yet, of course, the anguish of his ordeals was still with him. And it's interesting that even after Jacob's death, his brothers were still wary of him, because in response to their concerns, Joseph has to answer them and says, which he could see, of course, by this time when his brothers come down, and we know the story and I don't have to go through it. But he says that God sent me ahead of you to preserve you from a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household and ruler of all Egypt. And he says, of course, in chapter 50, he said, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So finally, at this stage of his life, you could probably say the penny drops. He could see that his dreams, the events that unfolded, the return of his brothers, the reunification with his father was all part of God's plan, so that in the end, he becomes, if you like, a type of Christ. He becomes a saviour. And I suppose then for us, really the message is that the thing with providence, God providing, is that, of course, most of the time it's it's realised in retrospect. When we can look past at events in our life and we think, well, okay, didn't turn out how it happened or how I wanted it to happen at the time, but I can see now that it was for the better, or it was a betterment of my character. And for us, look, we're no different from Joseph, but, fortunately in most cases, it's not a 20-year journey till we suddenly realise where we're at. So in conclusion, which you think, oh great, it's going to finish now. In conclusion, God works in our lives, of course, if we have belief and faith in him. And it's really God's providence in providing that we're all able to be here this morning and meet like we do. I mean, there's some countries in the world that you wouldn't be given this opportunity. And of course, in being here, we've also exercised our freedom of choice to do it. But God has, in his providence, provided his Son for all mankind. We, however, are blessed because we accept the gift of God, and so doing, commit our lives and our hopes in his care. And to finish with a quote from Paul, we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose.